Welcome to Pennsylvania in Focus. I'm Kristen Smith. Joining me today is the Center Square's Pennsylvania reporter, Christina Langell. And earlier this week, we had big municipal elections across the state, although there was one question in particular that mattered even to President Donald Trump, and that was the issue of judicial retention on our Supreme Court. So before we go any farther, let's explain what judicial retention means, because it's certainly confusing, and we weren't the only ones to try to explain it before the actual election.
Yes. So judicial retention is what happens every 10 years after a Supreme Court justice has been elected. So for the initial race for a Supreme Court justice, they campaign under a specific party, generally speaking, Democrats and Republicans. So after they've been elected, after 10 years, they are up for retention. Typically, this is sort of a non-issue. They just continue in that vein until 75, which is the mandatory age of requirement for Pennsylvania Supreme Court justices. And it really hasn't, since 1968, when they instituted this process, hasn't been a very political issue. The Pennsylvania Bar Association kind of says, hey, either yes or no, these judges are good to go. And then people just say, okay, keep them up. But there was one instance where a judge was not retained back in 2005, and that was a very political situation. I wasn't doing state legislative reporting then, but basically there was in the dead of the night, the legislature decided to pass a budget that would give them all pay increases, both, the executive, legislative, and judicial branch. They did this, and Governor Ed Rendell, I believe at the time, signed it. And people were really upset. People were really upset to see those pay raises come through. And as a result, the only sort of political action they could take was to take away this judge's retention and say, no, we're not keeping him. It didn't seem to have anything to do with who he was as a judge. And in this case, we again see this being a political issue, although I would say that they have centered this campaign a little bit more squarely around the justices' records and less to do with, just a reaction to other political issues.
Yes, the infamous pay raise scandal is the reason why we don't have legislative votes after 11 p.m. Now, they do suspend the rules from time to time when we have a budget deal. But I'm very glad that was a rule that was changed before I became a state legislative reporter, because I certainly would not want to be standing around at 3:00 in the morning waiting for them to pass a budget. But that's an aside to what we were talking about. So like you said, it's not normally political, but this time around it really was. And there was a lot of campaigning from conservatives to vote to stop this retention from happening. So talk more about why that was.
Yeah, so I think this is kind of part of the broader political campaign that's been mounted by conservatives to sort of affect change through the judicial branch, as well as, the other elected positions. So this wouldn't actually put a Republican judge in office. So most elections where we're watching a race, it's two people going against each other. In this case, it's just taking someone out of the office. And after that, Governor Josh Shapiro has the ability to appoint someone to fill that seat. But what I suspect, although I'm certainly, no one can be sure of these things, but given the stalemate that we've seen in the Senate when it comes to the budget, it's hard to imagine the governor having an easy time getting his picks approved, in which case we're just kind of dealing with this 2 Democrat, 2 Republican Supreme Court until the next odd year election, which is when the Supreme Court justices would be filled through an election. So that would be in 2027. At that point, obviously, Republicans would have the opportunity to run judges that are on board with their campaign agenda. So this is really an opportunity to try to upset the majority on the court. So a lot of what went into this was a lot of campaigning from very powerful Republican and Democratic campaigns. They spent, I think I read, over $15 million on this race. And it's not a race, it's not two people against each other. It's a very unusual circumstance. So they spent a lot trying to oust these judges or keep these judges. And for Republicans campaigning against the judges, they're saying, you know, they are radical leftists. They have an agenda that they are trying to fulfill. For the Democrats, they're like, you know, you need to keep these judges to save your rights to abortion, your rights to health care, your voting rights, and your rights as a worker. So they're kind of pitting it as this very political issue, even though the Supreme Court itself, you know, isn't out there writing laws. They're just out there making judgments on cases that are brought to them. But we've definitely seen how at the national level, the Supreme Court greatly affects the conservative or liberal swing of the actual legal environment.
Absolutely. There's this race and this issue in Pennsylvania has very strong echoes of what's happened nationally with the Supreme Court and the implications of such. So to keep up with this story and more, follow us at thecentersquare.com/Pennsylvania.